Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So just want to take time to give thanks to everyone who has so far liked, shared and subscribed. The new subscribers, welcome. I really appreciate the support over the last few days. The fact that you've come over from other channels to give mine a chance is really appreciated. Little shout out to the person who did comment about doing some solely doing cases on LGBT crimes. Whilst I do want to highlight those kind of cases, I do also want to take time to speak about lesser known cases, because I believe every victim in these cases needs a voice. Just because these people are no longer present among us, it doesn't mean that they are any less valid because of their sexual preference. And I just think it's really important to highlight everyone in these cases. So if you guys can just carry on doing what you're doing, it'll be really appreciated. You can also follow me at the Silhouette on Instagram. But all that said, let's get on with today's case. So today I'm going to be talking about Stephen Grieveson, who is he was known as the Sunderland Strangler. So Stephen John Grieveson, he was born in the 14th of December 1970. He was born to his parents Kathy and Terry Grieveson, and he was actually one of 7 children. So he grew up with 3 other brothers, Terry, Wayne and Alan, and he also had 3 sisters, Samantha, Catherine and Leanne. And they grew up in an area called Monk Wearmouth, or Monk Wearmouth, however you want to pronounce it. So this is in Sunderland, hence the moniker that he was given. So growing up, the 7 children, they were all exposed to domestic violence in the house, with Kathy bearing the most of Terry's anger. But Kathy, she was no shrinking wallflower, don't get me wrong. Kathy gave as good as she got to her husband, and the children witnessed all of this turmoil. And this is quite a common thing, if you are an avid viewer of true crime. Not all the time, but 9 times out of 10, it is a common thing that these children grew up with and they go on to commit further crimes. Not all of them turn out to be serial killers, but it's a common thing when you are watching videos, this sort of stuff is mentioned. So after around this time, after a bit too much, Terry, he actually leaves his family. Can't find any details on what became of him, but Kathy said that after this she really struggled looking after her 7 children, as Terry had basically no more contact with them after this point. She admitted that she just basically preferred going to the bingo. At age 11, Stephen, he began getting into trouble with the police, and one of these instances, he, in my eyes, just really, and probably to you as well, seems like really trivial, really minor, but he was caught for shoplifting. But the only thing that he stole was he'd opened up a pack of nails, and he'd taken one single nail, like not the whole pack, he just took one single nail, put the pack on the back on the shelf, and walked out the store with it. What he was actually going to do with that nail, no one knows. I don't think Stephen has ever said what he was actually going to do, but this led to the shopkeeper calling the police. Police arrested him, and it actually went to court. He was just given a slap on the wrist, but I think in their minds they were probably thinking that it would act as a deterrent. So they probably just said to him, if you carry on down this path and, shoplifting becomes a regular thing, you can get in a lot more severe trouble than just going to court for a slap on the wrist. But obviously, as we find out later down the line, this doesn't deter Stephen whatsoever. Um, so Stephen actually was arrested multiple times for over the years for multiple petty crimes, including drug offences and even sniffing glue. So if you guys were around in the 80s and I believe early 90s, I was born in 92, so I only have limited knowledge of glue sniffing, but this was apparently a really prevalent problem in certain areas amongst certain groups of teenagers, adults as well. But from what I heard from my mother, who grew up, I don't know if you can hear that. Sorry, guys. I really have no idea what that was. So yeah, my mum would tell me that glue sniffing was a really big problem, especially among teenagers in the 80s and 90s. So this resulted in Stephen being placed into a care plan with social services, and Stephen was removed from his family home, and he was placed into a boarding school. And this boarding school was based in Carlisle, and this was around the time that he was 13 years old. And Kathy, she later on said that I felt bad when he was sent away. I may not have brought him up properly. It wasn't just him. My eldest child had also gone into care, and I wasn't always there for them, as I was always at the bingo. I don't really want to give Kathy a hard time here. Obviously what she went through in her marriage must have been absolute hell, but to actively go out and choose a leisure activity such as bingo over your own family and not give them the support that they desperately needed, it's going to cause some feelings of betrayal. And personally, I could be wrong, but I believe Stephen's early crimes were probably just a cry for attention from his mother. So while at the boarding school, Stephen actually started playing football, and it was where he said that he had a natural talent for the sport, and he actually went on to play for a club called Clipper FC. But being in the school really did have its downsides for Stephen, and Stephen said that he was physically and sexually abused, and which led to him going on and abusing drugs. So again, a really another common thing that you do see, again, not with everyone who goes through sexual abuse, but 9 times out of 10, you do see that with abuse victims, that they want to get themselves out of that situation. And obviously we all know that alcohol and drugs sort of allow you to escape from that only temporarily, although feelings are going to come back, of course they are, but for just a brief moment you can escape from that reality. So it was while he was abusing drugs that Stephen turned to sex work to fund his addiction. And Stephen said that while doing this work, he was raped by a bunch of much older men, and these men would also bring their friends in to abuse Stephen as well. So this was sort of like in a gangbang situation or gang rape situation. So when he was 15, a social worker wrote in some reports that Stephen gives the impression that he is an emotionless boy, showing very little concern for anything. He spends little time with his family when away from the school, and spends most of the time with a small circle of friends, most of whom are involved in delinquency, and he has very little supervision from his parents. And another review from the following year, when he was 16, said that Stephen is a nervous, insecure boy who has little stability from his background or within himself, and he was very low opinion on himself. And his school reported that he was, again, just emotionless, who lacked any empathy. Said that he could act callous and he had no insight into the trouble that his behaviour caused. And 2 years later, Stephen turns 18 and he ends up leaving the boarding school. And he then goes back to Sunderland and he basically just quickly falls back into his old habits. So he's again seen and known for sniffing glue and also seen smoking weed. And obviously, smoking weed, it's not the worst thing in the world, in my eyes anyway. But then obviously, this eventuates onto him going around stealing people's cars. So the family, they end up becoming a target for the police, and the police would raid the house on a weekly basis, which caused a ton of friction between Stephen and Kathy. So by the time Stephen had turned 19 in 1989, he had racked up over 38 offences and he had spent weeks and months at a time in and out of prison. Around this time, he was just basically described as a bully, picking on younger boys, and eventually onto bullying pensioners. And it was during this time that Stephen struggled coming to terms with his own sexuality, and he said that he felt a lot of embarrassment and shame for being gay, and he would try and hide this by having girlfriends here and there. But Kathy said that he never really liked them, and she always knew that her son was gay. And this part of the story is where my sympathy begins and ends with Stephen. I'm someone who struggled a lot with my sexuality growing up. When I was at school, I had to deal with the after effects of Section 28. And I was also born in 92, like I said. So I was born very at the precipice of the AIDS pandemic. So coming to terms and realising I was gay at school, it wasn't easy. Multiple little digs and comments about AIDS and whatnot, and then, like I said, having to deal with the after effects of Section 28. It took me a very long time to come to terms and accept myself. Let's put it this way: what I do now, so talking to you guys as I am in front of you now in drag, I never ever would have done this or had the bottle to do this 2 years ago. And it was only when I turned, I think it was maybe around 29, 30, I really just started giving less of a fuck. And I thought, why not release the inner fabulousness that you see in front of you? That's my own opinion of myself. You might have a different one. But anyway, sorry, I digress, and just get back onto the story. So, 26th of November 1993, Stephen, at this point, he has a closing doors moment with his first victim, and this was 18-year-old Thomas Kelly. And Thomas left his home to go to his college, and his younger Lindsay said that she remembers Thomas just basically touching her head and saying bye. He would often call her Pins, and I believe she believes that he called her Pins this day rather than Lynn's. The family lived in Roker, and this was described as a really affluent area on the Sunderland coast. And Thomas was really well known in the area as he had worked as a paperboy growing up. And Lindsay said that they had a really close relationship and often wouldn't go to bed without saying "I love you" to each other. And during his paper rounds, Thomas would be seen going the extra mile for his customers. So if they were a particularly elderly person or an elderly couple, he would go to the shops and buy them any supplies that they needed. Or if they were on their own, he would sit with them and have a little chat with them and whatnot. So a really well-rounded, likable young man. So Thomas was also keen on helping the police out, and he would often take part in identity parades. And this was when, on this particular day, Thomas met Stephen Grieveson. So they were both in a lineup for a burglary, and this burglary was it was one that Stephen himself had actually committed. And he there and then decided it was Thomas that had grassed him up to the police. He then accosted Thomas outside the police station and threatened him, saying that he was going to kill him, which obviously genuinely scared Tom. And Thomas tried to basically keep away from Stephen from this point on. So, like I said, obviously 26th of November 93, Thomas leaves his house to go to his college, and he is on the bus, and coincidentally he ends up on the same bus that Stephen is taking. And despite an early altercation, Stephen convinced Thomas to come to the local allotments with him. And it was believed that at this point, Stephen made a sexual advance on Thomas, and Thomas pushed him away. And Stephen said that he felt a deep anger and embarrassment at this, and this then turned into paranoia that Thomas would start telling people that Stephen was gay. And Stephen decides then and there that the only way to keep the silence was to kill Thomas. So Stephen ends up overpowering him, and he strangles Thomas with his own scarf. He then placed Thomas's body inside the allotment shed, and he set the shed on fire. And this is obviously a bid for him to destroy any evidence. And he is, in a way, very effective at doing that, but there's also a small chance that not all the evidence is going to be destroyed in that fire. Like, they can still ascertain certain details when it comes time for the investigation. So later on that day, Judy Kelly, so it's Thomas's mum, so she comes home from work, and she said that it was really unusual that Thomas wasn't home. So she looked around for a note that he may have left. So obviously this was the early 90s, a very long time before everyone had mobile phones, and I believe from what I could read, the Kellys didn't even have a house phone. So around these times, obviously people would just leave like little notes here and there and just say, oh, I've gone to the shop, or I've gone to my friend's house, whatever mundane activity that they were doing. But it was just a way for obviously the parents to know where their children were. So Judy and Lindsay, they then begin walking the streets to see if they could find Thomas. So this was after a few hours of waiting, and he hadn't come home. And after a few hours of this walking, nothing had turned up. So she then assumed that Thomas was in the pub with his dad, just having a couple of after drinks works. But Tommy, so Thomas's dad, he eventually comes home later on, and Thomas is not with him. So they just couldn't understand where he was, and because this was so out of our character for Thomas. Judy and Tommy then waited up all night, basically listening for him to come home. So rolls around to the next day, the parents, they're just sitting there watching a news report, and it comes up about the body being found. Obviously he wasn't named, but a news report comes up about a body being found in a shed that had been set on fire. So they ended up contacting the police, and the police just basically wouldn't give them very many details. But they said that an officer would come over to their home, and so the Kellys had to wait another few hours for the officer to arrive. And the officer, when they arrived, they did something that I personally have never heard of, but they tried a set of keys that were found at the allotments, and this was obviously instead of the traditional knocking on the door. So Judy said that for a complete split second, she felt a wave of relief on her come over her. She thought this was her boy finally coming home, but her heart sank when she saw that the police were standing there, not her son. And one of the officers then said to his colleague, "Well, it must be him then." So when Thomas's body was found, he was still sadly burning, and close to his body was a pot of glue, and the investigators decided that this was how Thomas had died. His post-mortem come back as inconclusive due to solvent abuse, and this claim was one that Thomas's family completely disputed. So this is going to be a common theme throughout this case. If you are familiar with the Stephen Paul case and the Colin Island case, very, very similar, and obviously we can all see that it was just down to bigotry that's on the police officer's part. The fact that they probably A, drug abuse, B, probably thought it was later down the line, obviously gay teenagers, so that they just didn't really want to investigate. They just wanted to open a shut case. So, like I said, obviously Thomas's family, they disputed these claims, and they knew that he had never done anything like this. And the family, they pushed and pushed, they pushed for more answers. And whilst the police admitted it was really mysterious, they ended up just closing the case. And the police actually had arrested Stephen at this point over the body and about the fire. But Stephen said that he had no involvement, and the police just basically let him go. So we then jump to the 4th of February 1994, and 15-year-old David Hanson, who was a friend of Thomas's and a pupil at Monk Weymouth School. So David was one of 4 children born to Sheila and John, and he was described as really funny, smart, and a really great brother and son. So on that day, David met Stephen while just going about his business, and Stephen lured David into an abandoned house, and it's believed that Stephen made a sexual advance towards David. Again, David pushed him away, and Stephen then strangled David with a piece of cloth. He then laid his body on some rubbish and some wood, and again set the body on fire. So it was unclear as to when the fire was actually started, because as David's body was found on the 8th of February, so it was 4 days after he had died, they believed that it was possible that Stephen had gone away after he died and then come back a little while later to set fire. But he was found by some firemen who come out to put the flames out. So it's possible that Stephen came back on the 8th of February to set the fire. I don't know why he would have waited 4 days, but anyhow. So the house was only really a 10-minute walk from the allotments where Thomas was found. But the police, being the police at this time, who were meant to be investigating this, they didn't make that link. They didn't make the link that it was 2 young boys who were found in very similar circumstances, or the exact same circumstances in this case, 10 minutes apart, and only in a 2 month time frame. So again, David's death, he was just put down to solvent abuse, and David's autopsy come back as inconclusive. And this was actually by a different pathologist and then the one who worked on Thomas. So the only person that linked the two deaths was a local reporter, and they actually went and spoke to the police. And the police basically said that Thomas's death was a tragedy and that David's was just basically a coincidence. And they added, as long as there is not a third, it's basically all good. So Stephen, again, he was questioned following David's death, but he again denied it, was released. On the 25th of February, so only a little, about maybe 2 weeks later, a body of a 15-year-old David Grieve was also found burning in an allotment only 50 yards from where Thomas had been found. So obviously, because there's now two Davids in this case, I'm going to refer to them as David H, David G, just to obviously save any sort of confusion. So David G, he had been out and about when he sadly made contact with Stephen, and he told David G that he had some weed on him and he wanted to basically share this. And this is when they went back to the allotments. This is when Stephen sort of upped his criminal activity when it come to dealing with the boys, and David G was sadly raped by Stephen. He then forced David to perform oral sex on him, and then he strangled David G with a belt and set his body on fire. And his body was sadly found a few hours later with a belt still around his neck. And despite all of this, the police just brushed off the possibility of murder, and they said put forward that because the three boys had attended the same school, and that both the Davids were both 15, they were good friends, they put it down to solvent abuse again. The three families, they fought with the police and they were talking to the press to get their messages out, and they wanted to create a campaign for the police to reopen the cases. And this hard work and determination from the families, it eventually paid off. And this was when a detective by the name of Dave Wilson, so he was really well respected and really well known to be thorough with his jobs. He basically comes in and reopens all three cases. So Lindsay, Thomas's sister, said that he kept basically all three of the families up to date with any new evidence that had come forward. So he then looks at the autopsy reports and he requested that Thomas and both David's bodies were to be exhumed and re-examined. So this was actually approved, and in August 1994, two of the best pathologists in the country, they went up to Sunderland and they conducted post-mortems, and they determined that all three of the boys had the same cause of death. This was all strangulation, and this then was launched into finally a murder investigation. So the biggest clue was found when David Grieve's body was examined, and semen was actually found in his stomach still. And this sample, it was put through the DNA database, and it was a match. they found a match. And in September 1994, Stephen was finally arrested. Sorry, I got a bit ahead of myself there. So the match was made in 1994, and this was matched to Stephen. Stephen was actually in prison at this point for a different crime. So he had actually, in March that year, attempted an armed robbery on a chip shop, and this led to him being sent to prison. I couldn't find what sentence he actually received at this point, so he was currently serving time when he was rearrested. So it was during the investigation of the house where David Hage had been murdered. One of Stephen's fingerprints were found, and witnesses also come forward to say that they had seen Stephen walking with David that day. Stephen, like I said, he was arrested in his cell, and when the families were notified, this basically didn't come as any sort of surprise to them. So obviously you can see that Stephen was well known in his area for being a troublemaker. So Lindsay says that when Stephen was arrested for the murders, we weren't shocked at all, because it's what we had been fighting for months and months, and we kind of knew it was him. We knew the boys had done nothing wrong, and we knew that someone had done what they did to them. So Stephen's trial, it begins in 1996, and he entered a plea of not guilty. So he basically maintained that he was innocent throughout the entire trial. He believed that there was no evidence, as it had been destroyed in the fire. And he put forward that he had been questioned after each murder, but he had been let go each time. And during the trial, Stephen was seen laughing really loudly. He went so far as to give really obnoxious behaviour and wave at the families. He was giving them the middle finger, he was pulling faces, and just really being an absolute tosser. I can't think of any other better word for it, to be honest. Well, I can, but I can't say that word on here. But let's just say it's can't with a U. So the trial ended up lasting 6 weeks, and it took the jury only 4 hours to find Stephen guilty of 3 counts of murder. And the verdict was then read out. The gallery erupted in cheers. Stephen remained silent and kept his head down. And in his summing up, the judge, Mr. Justice Holland, so he said that you murdered Thomas Kelly after finding an efficient and effective way to kill him and conceal the evidence by setting fire to his body. And so far from being appalled by what you've done, when the opportunity arose to repeat the experience, you did it again. It could be the one reason, perhaps the only reason, was that you liked killing. So by that stage, you were plainly evil and even more plainly dangerous. Mercifully, you were soon in custody and the killing stopped. So on the 28th of February 1996, Stephen was handed 3 life sentences for the murders, and he was ordered to serve at least 35 years in prison. So it's basically 35 years that he has to serve before he is even considered for parole. We all know this. We watch enough of these videos to know how that works. He was then sent to HMP Full Sutton in Yorkshire, and it was while serving his sentence that Stephen reportedly began showing remorse. He started writing letters to the families. He was asking for forgiveness, and he was so far as offering to take his own life. He said things about, possessing a gun and giving it to them for them to shoot him. So, jump forward to the year 2000. So Dave Wilson, he begins looking through some cold cases in the area, and he come across the case of a 14-year-old boy called Simon Martin. So Stephen's DNA was actually found in the house where Simon's body was found. Um, Officers then went to Full Sutton to speak to Stephen, and he again denied any involvement. But again, as we're going to find out, Stephen was actually lying. So we just jump back to the 18th of May 1990. So Simon, like I said, he was 14 years old. He got permission from his parents, Robert and Jane, if he could go and play football in the local park. And they said, yeah, that's fine, but you have to be back by 6 o'clock for your dinner. So on his way, he then meets 20-year-old Stephen, and the two, they start playing football. And then Stephen then took Simon to an abandoned building where Stephen sexually assaulted Simon and then began screaming at him and threatening him. But Stephen wasn't convinced that Simon was going to keep his mouth shut about this. So he began strangling Simon before basically hitting Simon over the head with a brick. And so 6 p.m. comes around. Simon failed to come home. Robert, he waited for a few hours before trying to find his son. He then returns home and contacted the police. So on the 26th of May, Simon's body was found half naked by 2 other children, and the police, they quickly launched a murder investigation, and their only lead was a fingerprint which was found in a pool of blood. So this fingerprint, it was run through the database and it flagged up as a 16-year-old local boy. He was then arrested, but he obviously profusely denied any involvement. The case actually went to court, but the 16-year-old boy, he ended up being cleared of all charges. I couldn't really get a wonderful lot of information other than the fact that it was put forward that many other kids in the area, including this boy, they would go to this house. It was known to be derelict for quite some time, and you guys may have done that as well. I definitely did when I was a kid. We'd find a really rundown house or a rundown warehouse or something and just hang about in there smoking. If we could get someone to get us alcohol, we'd be drinking. Because it's a really common thing that teenagers do when they're growing up. So this was the only explanation that they could give for this boy's fingerprint being in the blood at the time. So then they interviewed Stephen after a tip-off, after someone had said that they had seen Stephen and Simon together. As it was known that Stephen hung around with younger boys to bully him. Stephen said that basically he had never ever been in that house at this particular time. And the police, as they did with the other 3 murders, they took his word on that, and Simon's case sadly went cold. So we then, frustratingly, we jump to 2012, and Stephen, he finally confesses to Simon's murder, saying that he had been haunting him and that he had self-harmed because of it. He said that he wanted to give the family some sort of peace of mind. So this eventuated onto a second trial, and that began in November 2013 at Newcastle. And Stephen, despite his earlier pleas that he was admitting it because it played on his mind, Stephen goes on to say he's not guilty of Simon's murder. He puts forward that the whole thing was just basically a terrible accident. He said that after it was finished, I got scared and I started strangling him. I didn't let go, and the next thing I know, there was a rock. I picked it up and I smashed his head in. I don't know about you guys. That doesn't sound like an accident to me. You know, an accident is when you fall down the stairs or you cut yourself when you're chopping an onion. You know, that's an accident. Picking up a rock and smashing someone on the head with it, it takes some force. That's not an accident. That's premeditated. You've thought about doing that and you've let that intrusive thought out. So Simon's family, they were actually in the gallery and were even joined by Thomas and both of the David's families. And Stephen was actually found guilty of Simon's murder. And after a 9-day trial, he was given another life sentence on top of his existing 3. So on the 20th of February 2014, Stephen, yet again, he was arrested. So he was arrested for the murder of a 7-year-old girl, Nikki Allen. So you guys may be familiar with this case. So Nikki, like I said, she was a 7-year-old girl who terribly was murdered in October 1992. She'd been stabbed 37 times, she'd been sexually assaulted, and they looked at this case and they saw slight similarities between her death and the death of the 4 boys. And so they wanted to speak to Stephen again, despite the glaring obvious facts that Nikki was a girl. So unfortunately, obviously, yes, Nikki's case went cold, and he was later cleared of this charge, as it was found that, obviously, fortunately, someone else was convicted of this charge. That was, again, took a very long time for them to process, to investigate. And in 2017, the police said that they had isolated some DNA, and this wasn't Stephen. So at this point, Stephen's ruled out. And in 2019, they arrested the suspects, and in 2023, so May of last year, David Boyd was finally found guilty of Nikki's murder and sentenced to 29 years in prison. So that is the end of this story. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me and listening. I hope in some odd way you enjoyed it. I will be back next Friday with a new case. I've got a really exciting one. Well, no, I don't want to say exciting. It's not really probably the appropriate word, but a really different sort of case that I want to discuss with you guys. But if you can just keep liking, sharing and subscribing, really appreciated. To all my new subs, welcome. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to talk to you guys. Whatever you're doing over this coming weekend, sorry. Hope you stay safe, and I will see you next Friday. Take care. Have a good evening.